Hello, everybody, and welcome to session 19 of the PWL International Seminar. As you know, the seminar is hosted by IFILNOVA in the context of the FCT-funded project Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, which is about to end. It's ending already next month, so this is our second last session. And it is a great pleasure and honor for me to finally meet and now introduce you to our speaker today. At his request, this will be a rather short introduction. Sajjad Rizvi is Professor of Islamic Intellectual History and Director of Global and Area Studies, University of Exeter. He was trained as an intellectual historian at Oxford and Cambridge, and he's a specialist on the philosophical traditions of the Islamic East. He's the author of Sadra and Metaphysics, Modulations of Being, published by Routledge in 2008. And he's currently working on a short manifesto on global and Islamic philosophy. Today, he's going to give his talk on philosophy as a way of life in Islamic philosophy, and we are really looking forward to it. So without further ado, thank you so much for accepting this invitation, Sajjad, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Marta. It's a pleasure being here, and I'll apologize for not having a PowerPoint at this stage when the term's just about to start. And we're all kind of preparing PowerPoints for my students. You kind of start to get a bit sick of it, really. I'm going to try and keep this fairly straightforward. I'll start, of course, with the classic caveat that I'm not a philosopher. I'm sure many of you are. And so while there are things which I will have to say which are evaluative, I'm more interested in kind of giving you snapshots of resources that we can bring from the Islamic traditions into conversation with Addo. That's what I'm primarily interested in doing. What I will do is I will say a few things first about what I think philosophy as a way of life is, just to make it clear what I am bringing to conversation. And then I will very briefly, partly because it kind of ties in with the paper I'm doing for Marta for the Oxford Handbook. And one of the things you have to do in Oxford Handbooks is to say something very briefly about who's done work on this particular area. So I'll just very quickly mention some of the very few studies which actually invoke Addo within the context of making sense of Islamic philosophy. And then I will say a bit more about some of the case studies that I want to present to you. And in those case studies, I'm going to spend most time on the philosopher I know best, who is Mullah Sadr Shirazi, who died in 1636 in Safavid, Iran. And along the way, I'll also very briefly consider Avicenna, just because he is such a pivotal figure in the Islamic traditions, as well as some others between Avicenna and Mullah Sadr. And then finally, I want to just consider the whole question of applicability and scope of philosophy as a way of life. I'm perfectly aware, as I'm sure everyone is, that there can be a sense in which philosophy as a way of life can be somewhat a totalizing approach to understanding philosophy in certain contexts. There are, of course, criticisms of Addo saying that it doesn't necessarily work for every school and every manifestation of ancient philosophy. And certainly in what I'm presenting, I don't want to suggest that every philosopher and thinker and indeed Sufi in the Islamic traditions can be read in this particular way. And I want to raise some possible objections and some challenges to that conversation, and the question of the commensurability of an addition approach to philosophy of way of life and the way in which the practice and reality of philosophy is understood in those traditions. Okay, so let me first start with this issue of what do I understand philosophy, a way of life, to be. For me, the issue is one of, sorry, I'm just playing around with these things on my screen, is basically about how philosophy as a certain practice entails a therapy and a care for the self, a form of self-cultivation, indeed, and particularly of a process of self-transformation. So in particular, what we have here is a clarification that philosophy is a particular kind of path which has an end, and that end is what we call wisdom. And what often tends to happen is that there is a confusion between philosophy and wisdom as its end, and there's often a confusion between philosophical discourse and the very act of philosophy as a way of getting to a particular kind of end. Now, within the earliest Arabic translations already in Baghdad, one of the key texts which was translated was Nicomachus of Gerassa's Introduction to Arithmetic. And in the Introduction to Arithmetic, of course, Nicomachus makes a very important distinction between philosophy and wisdom. Philosophy is a particular path to wisdom, but not the end in itself. And this distinction between the pursuit and the love of wisdom and wisdom itself, which we may also call the station of being a sage, or the status of being a sage, is absolutely critical for a number of the later Islamic traditions. So the first point really is, philosophy is a particular path to self-cultivation, and not in itself the end, but rather something which is distinct from wisdom. The associated point, I guess, is that there is, it isn't within the nature of the human self or the soul. Of course, the term that would be used in Islamic context is much more conducive to be translated as soul. In itself is something which is capable of transformation and capable of improvement and capable of, as they would put it, perfection. And that that particular soul is also, in a sense, innately hardwired to improve. It's capable of receiving stimuli which allow it to become more than it is. There is a particular kind of soul. It's capable of transformation, it's capable of change, and it's capable of perfection. And the goal of that perfection, of course, is ultimately the acquisition of sagehood. And this station of being a sage, the station of sagehood, is directly associated with the Platonic goal of godlikeness. Philosophy as godlikeness, as we have it in the Platonic tradition. This is extensively cited in some of the earliest Arabic witnesses that we have about how we understand the nature of philosophy and wisdom. And I think this point about godlikeness is significant because, I'll say something a bit more about this later, but while it is mentioned in passing a couple of times by Addo, and it's of course related to the notion of the view from above and the nature of the sage, it doesn't seem to be as central to Addo's conception of the sage as it certainly would be for most of the Muslim thinkers, both writing in Arabic and Persian, that I'm looking at. So this question of godlikeness, following the model of both the Timaeus, the Timaeus' demiurge, being like the Timaeus' demiurge, and this notion of fleeing the vicissitudes of our embedded and embodied life put forward in the Theaetetus is absolutely essential to this notion of sagehood. Now, the other, of course, obvious aspects are the second aspect, in a sense, is the question of spiritual exercises, which, of course, for Addo are essential for the way in which philosophy as a way of life actually works. That's the actual kind of day-to-day practice. And of course, there are a number of spiritual practices which are put forward by Addo himself. And some of these we can see occurring within the Islamic traditions. And of course, there are many others which might be subsumed within an Addosian context. The question, of course, sometimes is what doesn't fit. And the question of spiritual exercises is interesting because it's so central, but also in a sense it's rather vague. It's rather vague, and that's partly because of the very sense in which we tend to use the term spiritual attached to it. And so that raises the question of whether the sorts of practices which in Arabic would be called riyada, and riyada is literally just an exercise, necessarily fit what Addo is talking about with respect to spiritual exercises. And then the third aspect, of course, of philosophy as a way of life, which I'm interested in arising from Addo, is this notion of the community of the sage. So if philosophy is the pursuit of sagacity and the station of being a sage, and that involves conducting certain kinds of exercises and following a particular sage, then how does one do that? What sort of community of the sage do we have? What constitutes a particular tradition and a school in which one works? And interestingly, of course, and this is not an unusual kind of observation. Famously, Jonathan Ganeri makes this observation for Indian philosophies. The problem we have here is that we actually have very little detail given about what the community of the sage is and how people actually studied and how people interacted with sages. We have a lot of, I guess, what you might call theory, and much of what I'm going to present in my case studies of the examples from the Islamic traditions are primarily deal with theory. We have a lot less by way of kind of social historical examples of how this actually worked out. And I think in many ways this tends to be a problem of understanding what the community of the sages, precisely because in most cases we know very little about these practices. And in certain cases we also know we don't know a lot about the thinkers involved in as well. We often primarily have just the evidence of the texts themselves and very little around it. So, for example, one of the texts, which I'm going to briefly discuss in a bit, we only have one account about who he was and kind of where he was, which is literally something like 6 lines. And there's really nothing else in the archive which tells us anything more about him. So that does, of course, raise a particular kind of problem. Now, before coming to the philosophical examples and to extend some of these observations about how I'm understanding Addo, it's worth mentioning that, like many other traditions, there are, even in the classical Arabic traditions, ideas about self-cultivation, ideas about in a sense, the growth of the self, the magnanimity of the self, and the complementarities between what one knows, what one does, and more generally how one comports oneself. So in Arabic, these are the notions of ilm being knowledge, amal being what one does and practices, and adab being the kind of broad notion of comportment and manners and etiquette and social and societal norms. And we find both scriptural and other aspects of early Arabic texts precisely on these sorts of complementarities. So it's not good enough, for example, to know what is good, to know the nature of reality. There have to be implications for what one does following that, and that knowledge and how one practices then should also have an impact on the sort of person that you are. So this kind of moral centrality of knowledge and practice is absolutely essential. And sometimes, as I said, it's articulated in Quranic verses. I can give you some examples, but which the early Arabic tradition conceived of this tradition of the relationship between knowledge, practice, and comportment, not least in the reception of this very famous corpora, the famous corpora of aphorisms associated with Hippocrates that were translated early on in the translation movement in Baghdad. And there's been, for example, a recent project on those aphorisms at Exeter, which present that. Now, I think it might be useful also to clarify why I'm interested in this and this in Addo and trying to facilitate these sorts of conversations. And this is also to then present something about how other specialists on Islamic philosophy have been seen to engage with Addo. So my kind of engagement with Addo began with my PhD, and already in my dissertation on Mullah Sadra, I invoke Addo a number of places, just because I was trying to make sense of how we can understand a certain conception of self and philosophy before we try to make sense of the doctrinal positions and arguments. For me, it didn't make much sense merely talking about the arguments in a sense in a vacuum without understanding that in a prior sense. And increasingly, I'm more interested now in how we can potentially use philosophy as a way of life to partly perhaps change or develop the way in which we see philosophy, but also to articulate a certain idiom whereby we can talk in a global and in an intercultural sense about philosophy. So how it can act as an idiom which connects, for example, Islamic philosophies with Indian philosophies, with African philosophies, and so forth. And I think that broader intention is something which I'm quite interested in. And in that sense, it lies alongside, for example, my interest in Platonism. I think Platonism is one particular kind of philosophy as a way of life, which does that rather well with respect to the way in which Islamic philosophy can come into conversation with other philosophical traditions, not least in Europe. Of course, there are other colleagues who have also engaged with Addo in slightly different ways and for different purposes. And I want to just mention 3 examples. So the first is a colleague who's based in San Francisco, Mohammad Azadpour. And Azadpour wrote a book which was published in 2011 on Avicenna. And he was trying to, in a sense, refresh the way in which we tend to look at Avicenna. One of the fundamental problems with a lot of the literature in Avicenna studies tends to be kind of mired in certain kinds of controversies. So there's a classic controversy about the nature of Avicenna's epistemology, whether, for example, in rather simplistic, but also kind of gives you a sense of the absurdity of some of these debates, whether he's an empiricist or a rationalist. And there is an ongoing problem of trying to make sense of how Avicenna deals with the non-propositional and whether he has space for what we might call mysticism or mystical experiencing inquiry. So Azadpour's intervention is precisely in that, and to try and take us away from those kind of sterile debates and to draw upon phenomenology in particular. And in fact, one of the things he says is that he's interested in drawing upon phenomenology so that he can dissolve certain dualities which seem to be stark and central. One is the duality between, of course, mind and body, and the other one is the duality between theory and practice. And this is precisely where he invokes Addo by saying that philosophy as a set of spiritual exercises for self-transformation and the acquisition of wisdom are as essential for Avicenna as they were for the ancients in terms of presented by Addo. And alongside that, of course, is the observation that philosophical discourse, while it can be a certain kind of spiritual exercise, is in itself not identical to wisdom or the goal of wisdom itself. So ethical commitment in the cultivation of the self and good character is absolutely essential to Azadpour's reading of Addo. And in fact, one of the kind of the side polemics that Azadpour is interested in is to push back against a position articulated by people like Sayyid Hussain Nasr, who've argued that the course of philosophy in Islam is one in which begins with falsafa as a kind of Aristotelian endeavor with the likes of Avicenna, and then it moves towards a more kind of complex pursuit of and acquisition of wisdom, culminating with people like Mullah Sadr. So Nasser's argument is that there isn't very much by way of spiritual exercise or the merging of theory and practice in Avicenna. This comes about in the later tradition. In contrast and in opposition to this, Azadpour actually argues that the way in which we tend to see the later philosophical tradition with Mullah Sadr actually begins with Avicenna. It's Avicenna's own kind of concern with the ethical core of what doing philosophy is, and seeing what he's doing as a set of spiritual exercises is already there in his text. And in a bit, I will give you one example of how we might do that, although it's not actually the example that Azadpour himself mentions. Azadpour's main criticism of Addo is this problem of mysticism, because he sees Addo as being not particularly open to the notion of mysticism, and he quotes Addo at one point talking about at least being agnostic about the mysticism of Plotinus. the way Azadpur deals with this is to say that this is where one can use the work of Henri Corbin, in a sense, as a completion of an Adocian approach to Avicenna, precisely because it is with Corbin that we find the centrality of mystical insight and experience to the practice and the pursuit of wisdom. The second example is a more recent work which came out in 2021 by Muhammad Omar Farooq. It's a work called Sculpting the Self, and it's basically about understanding selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic thought and how one can bring that into conversation with debates on selfhood and subjectivity in contemporary Euro-American philosophies. Here he is, again, he tends to draw upon Addo as advocating philosophy as a way of life entailing the spiritual normativity of the self, in which the self is transformed through spiritual exercises, which are meditative, cognitive, somatic, and so forth, such that the self can be elevated to a higher level of being. For Farooq, this is so much that is all well and good. The main example that Farooq draws upon of the usage of this is with Mullah Sadr. And again, I will leave that to when I discuss Mullah Sadr in a few minutes, because Farooq actually deals with some of the same sorts of texts that I look at as well. The main criticism Farooq poses to Addo is this problem of what do we really mean by spirituality, and the sense in which, as I've mentioned before, the term spiritual and spirituality can seem to be rather vague. The third and final example of others who've looked at Addo and philosophy as a way of life with respect to Islamic traditions, I think is in some ways a more interesting and creative one. And this is Olodumini Ogunaike's study of West Africa, both Tijani Sufism and the Ifa traditions of the Yoruba in West Africa. And in that sense, what we can see in Ogunaike's work is both bringing African or Africana philosophy and Islamic thought into conversation with Addo. And very importantly, I think what he does do is he raises this question of going beyond what we normally associate with philosophy within these traditions, to bring them and to make sense of them as a philosophical project. So, for example, one of the things he says is that a lot of people who tend to have studied Sufism look at it as the expression of a religious tradition, or they're interested in collecting and analyzing data of an ethnographic and cultural sense, but very rarely do they look at Sufism as a particular mode of knowing and being, which is an expression of a philosophical project. And that's precisely what he wants to do, and that's why he thinks using Addo is useful to draw that out. So his point is that both amongst Tijani Sufis in West Africa, as well as Ifa traditional practitioners, they use a set of spiritual exercises as therapeutic and directed towards the pursuit, directed towards the acquisition of wisdom and sagacity, and that these are often done and usually done through the following of a certain kind of spiritual master or sage who directs adepts in them, precisely so that one can arrive at the status of the sage, who then has in that famous phrase of Pierre Hadot, have the view from above. And so in one of the important things that Ogunnaike says is that it's then a useful way of looking at Sufism not just as a set of doctrines and theories, but actually as theoria in the more classical sense of a cultivation of contemplation and the wisdom of and a vision of truth. Now, Ogunnaike, interestingly, does not raise any kinds of objections. He's mainly interested in seeing how one can deploy Hadot to this end. And I think what's most interesting is precisely the point I made, which is that he's extending it beyond philosophical schools and traditions such as Avicenna through to Sufism. And I think that potentially is a very productive way of doing it. While later thinkers like Mullah Sadr, of course, draw upon the practices and ideas of Sufism, I think there is great scope at looking at Sufis and their practices in and of themselves, who don't define themselves as philosophers, and using philosophy as a way of life as accessing, in a sense, what they are trying to do and what their ends are. And in particular, one direction which the next step of kind of what I'd like to do with this, my broader engagement with philosophy as a way of life, just to mention this, is I'm particularly interested in poets in the 17th and 18th centuries. So one of the features of, for example, Persian poets writing in that period is not just their metaphysical concerns and their concerns, especially those writing in North India, to bring different sets of narratives and myths and indeed worldviews and practices into conversation with each other, but also to really see the way in which poetry is not just a vehicle for the articulation of philosophical doctrine, but actually is a way of doing philosophy itself. And the way then it's supposed to have an impact on those who then receive and hear and engage with that poetry. And that becomes even more clearly articulated when that poetry becomes, say, part of a song and where there is a musical repertoire involved in that. So I think that would be a really interesting kind of next sort of direction to take that in. Now, let me move on to my case studies of thinkers within the Islamic tradition, which we can bring into conversation with Hadot on these points. Now, the first one, as I mentioned before, is Avicenna. And this is precisely, I guess, in a sense, controversial because of the so-called problem of Avicenna mysticism. And just to kind of engage that, let me just focus on that one particular text, which is central to this. One of the later works that Avicenna wrote, so one of his Summa, is Pointers and Reminders. And Pointers and Reminders, like many texts in that period, is divided up into a section on logic, physics, and then metaphysics. And the metaphysics actually culminates in a section that we might describe as ethics and politics. And we find, for example, that same culmination of ethics and politics at the end of metaphysics in Avicenna's Metaphysics of the Cure as well. Now, in the 9th section of the physics and metaphysics section of Pointers, Avicenna has a discussion of what he calls the stations or the states of we could call them Gnostic, or at least types of knowers who have some sort of intuitive grasp, a non-propositional grasp of reality. And the term in Arabic is an arif. So he has an extensive discussion of what this means. And in particular, here he is, he relates this to a sort of a hierarchy of three types of people. And in ascending order, they are the abid in Arabic. So the abid is someone who is a creature, a worshipper, but a creature who is cognizant of his creaturely nature. Then the next stage up is that of the ascetic. And the ascetic is someone who is embarking on the path of self-cultivation and spiritual practice. And then you have the station of the arif, the Gnostic or the knower, who has arrived at the reality of the realization of truth and the vicinity of the beatitudes of the One. What is quite clear to me is that this whole section, in many ways, acts as a commentary on the very famous passage in Plotinus's Aeneid's 481 about the doffing of the body and the ascent of the soul to the beatific experience and ecstasy, being in the vicinity of the One, which is associated with the immortality and the immateriality of the soul. That's very clearly going on here. And it's in some ways particularly interesting because Avicenna, there is this sort of tension within Avicenna between more kind of Aristotelianizing and what one might call Neoplatonizing tendencies. So he's attracted by this particular idea, but then he very famously, commenting on this particular passage when it's found in the Theology of Aristotle, is very critical of it because he sees it as being something which is non-Aristotelian, i.e. basically Platonic, which raises issues for him. But there, as I said, there is this kind of Neoplatonizing tendency with him as well. So one expression of that in this particular passage is to identify the nature of love, or particularly of erotic motion, as something which is inbuilt in the person, which is precisely what propels the soul to seek out what is better, to seek its own perfection and transformation. So in the immediate instance, that is about seeking out the sage who will help the person perfect themselves, and ultimately to seek out the station of the sage as well, and being at a higher, becoming at a higher level of being. So that that already is something which is there in Avicenna, and that's something which a number of his commentators pick up as being quite significant, in a sense, a culmination of, as I've said, his metaphysics. One of those commentators in the 13th century is Nasiruddin Tusi, and Tusi is absolutely essential for the later reception of Avicenna, particularly on the pointers and reminders. And Tusi himself has a text that he wrote in Persian called Sayr Suluk. So Sayr Suluk, I guess, means journeying and wayfaring, and in the later tradition is basically a synonym for Sufism. And in this particular text, which is a bit like Tusi's kind of spiritual autobiography, he particularly talks about the nature of the path, the spiritual path, as salvific, as seeking the therapy of the soul, and involving its self-transformation through the acquisition of a spiritual doctor or sage who can guide the adept and to can cure the the vices of ignorance within that person. The aspect that Tusi brings in here, which actually becomes quite important for the later tradition, is the way in which spiritual exercises, of course, are conducted under the guidance of a spiritual master or a sage, and one also learns from the practice of the sage. But there is also an external motivation, which one calls either divine providence or divine grace, which is an essential aspect of the ability of the soul to successfully transform. Now, that of course brings in a very important religious element, and this is something I'm going to come back to, because it's something which runs throughout most of the Islamic traditions, is the way in which spirituality then takes on this very clearly kind of religious set of commitments, and this sort of desire for divine grace or divine intervention to help facilitate this. Now, I'm just going to give you one final short example before I turn to Mullah Sadr, who's my main kind of example. And this is a figure who is not terribly well known. As I mentioned, there is only one witness to who he is. Even that only is about 6 or 5 sentences about him. Before I mention him, one other example I could make, and it's something I've written about separately, is about the 12th century thinker Sohrawardi and what I would call Platonism as such in the Islamic tradition, which is normally known as Ishraq, or illumination. In that particular tradition, you have a very clearly articulated notion of who the sage is, how one acquires and understands, how one kind of finds a sage, what the features of the sage are, and as well as some of the more kind of embodied spiritual practices which are associated with then following the sage. And in particular, these are, for example, the classic Pythagorean one of vegetarianism, which Sohrawardi mentions as explicitly like the only way you can really understand philosophy and pursue wisdom is if you refrain from eating animals. Yeah, so the example I want to give you is a 13th century figure who's very little known as Qutbuddin Ahari. He dies after 1258. And in his work, you find many of the features which become very common in the work of Mullah Sadr in particular later. So you have, again, a division of the text into a section on metaphysics, on the physics, and then on ethics and the nature of the divine. He has the distinction between philosophy and wisdom that I mentioned earlier, and it is wisdom itself which is the grasping of the reality of things and realizing the realities of things insofar as it's humanly possible, which of course recalls the famous definitions of philosophy and godlikeness. And in fact, the same definition of wisdom is given by Mullah Sadr later. He's also a Platonist with respect to his use of the theory of forms. He, in a section on ethics, which is really about the nature of the human soul, he stresses the need for self-cultivation and self-transformation through acquiring the eternal divine virtues. Now, this is, of course, an allusion to a very famous Sufi saying, acquire the virtues of God, which is the main way in which godlikeness is articulated in the Sufi tradition. Perhaps most telling about his text is that the very last section of his text is on the nature of spiritual exercises, on riyad, that, which comes at the end of a section on the nature of the afterlife and salvation. And alongside the discussion of the immortality of the soul and its unity, he talks about different kinds of spiritual exercises, both ones which are corporeal and self-mortificatory, as well as those which are spiritual and contemplative, ways in which one purifies one's self of vices and adorns oneself with virtues. Perhaps the key point about Ahari is the way in which he kind of mixes philosophical and Sufi forms of discourse and terminology to present a particular path. And the text itself, the title of the text is the summation or the culmination of wisdom. That's what he's ultimately interested in. So philosophy, Sufi practices are a particular path towards sagacity and wisdom. The final example I want to give you is Mullah Sadra himself, a 17th century thinker. As I just mentioned, he gives a definition of wisdom in his main work, The Four Journeys, which is pretty much exactly taken from Ahari. And so this is the idea of wisdom as the perfecting of the human soul through the cognition of realities of existence as there truly are, and judgments about their being ascertained through demonstration, not grasped through conjecture or adherence to authority, according to what is humanly possible. And through this process of perfection, one can ascribe to the world a rational order according to human capability, so that that person may attain a resemblance to the Creator. So this is precisely this notion of God-likeness. Of course, in this passage, he then continues to relate wisdom precisely to wisdom as it's discussed in the Quran and within the prophetic tradition, to show that there is an element of grace and of providential gift which allows for this process to happen. And in fact, the kind of complementarity between that and this more kind of religious commitment is clear when he gives a definition at the beginning of his Quranic exegesis of why it is that one undergoes or undertakes exegesis, which is pretty much exactly the same as his definition of wisdom. The pursuit of wisdom is, in a sense, the same whether one is engaging with philosophical texts and philosophical practices, or whether one is engaging with revelation and other forms of revelation, such as natural theology in the world, where one can see the manifestation of the divine. Now, along the way, so we have this definition of philosophy and wisdom in Mullah Sadra. You have him articulating this idea that there is something innate within the human nature, which inclines one to want to know more. You cannot, as he puts it, humans cannot restrain themselves from striving to understand things that are elevated beyond their ken. And that the more one increases in knowledge, the more one increases in yearning and seeking. Part of that is because there is a homology or complementarity between the human and the cosmos itself, the notion of the microcosm and the macrocosm, which, of course, I'm sure would be familiar to you from the Pythagorean tradition in particular. That this pursuit of knowledge, as Mullah Sadra puts it, is precisely so that proper self-knowledge can then render for the person this state of godlikeness, so that one can, as he puts it, become a divine knower by negating his human self and become immersed in witnessing the beauty of the One and its glory. And in this passage, he then quotes a saying attributed to Aristotle, which is almost definitely from the Neoplatonic corpus translated in the classical tradition. He who fails to know himself fails to know his creator as well. So spiritual practices are mentioned extensively in the work of Mullah Sadra, and some of these are explicitly religious kinds of practices, so the invocation of the divine names, and other kinds of what I would call divine name theurgy, which in some ways would place him alongside the likes of Iamblichus in later sort of Neoplatonism, with the stress upon theurgy, the complementarity of the body and the soul. He also talks about the qualities of the sage that one has to seek out to act as a guide and a mentor. And the ones that he mentions in particular are the sage possesses qualities of generosity, good humor, fine judgment, pronounced taste, and experiences of spiritual insight. And of course, the fact that the sage himself also undergoes spiritual exercises to constantly perfect themselves and to keep at that state of perfection. As I mentioned before, one of the problems precisely is kind of trying to make sense of what the community of the sage is. And we only have certain kinds of glimpses for Mullah Sadra because we don't really have many details. We know only towards the end of his life he was teaching formally in a seminary, but most of the time he was teaching very small circles of individuals. But we have some letters that he exchanged with his own particular teacher and with his students. And these do talk about the nature of the spiritual exercises which were required, because there are ways of preparing the self in the pursuit of sagehood and in the pursuit of wisdom. And as I said before, the really central element of this for Mullah Sadra is godlikeness, and godlikeness in a way for him is very much one rooted in a certain kind of a religious commitment. Now, I want to just kind of wrap up by raising some of the challenges that I see within the examples that I've given you and how they can be brought into conversation. So I've already mentioned them all, but I'll just kind of recap on what I see them to be, and to sort of again remind you of what I'm really interested in, which is this kind of broader question of method. How do we pursue a comparative and intercultural global approach to philosophy? How do we might we be able to find certain kinds of idioms which allow us to bring different traditions of thought into conversation? Elsewhere, I've written a paper which brings some of these insights from Mullah Sadra into conversation with elements of Mahayana Buddhism, which, and of course, I'm sure many are familiar with the fact that there's a lot more work which has been done on the relationship between Buddhisms and Ado and philosophy as a way of life. So that's my kind of broader interest. But as I said, I think there are certain kinds of problems of what we might call kind of false friends. One is the way in which the very notion of spiritual exercises can seem to be rather broad and vague, and to what extent, I mean, what is the limit to what we might consider a spiritual exercise to be, especially when we look at the comparison with the sort of exercises that are articulated in an Islamic context. We have this kind of related problem of incommensurabilities. At what point, are there certain notions within Adu which are just incommensurable? And that's in a sense where perhaps this issue of religion and the religious commitment may arise, precisely because, as I mentioned, a number of what Mullah Sadra and others would recognize as spiritual exercises are also what are recognizably religious kinds of exercises. The commonality is precisely this notion of where the end of that is, with the pursuit of wisdom and the divine kind of view from above, so to speak. I guess the last kind of point I want to make with respect to a challenge is precisely the one I mentioned about the nature of the community, just because in most cases it's extremely difficult for us to make sense of how philosophy worked, how philosophy was practiced, how the theory perhaps that is articulated in the texts may have been actualized in different social contexts. And it's one which really requires us to really think a bit more. Some time ago, I tried to write a piece on the practice of philosophy in the 16th, 17th century Iran. And it's quite clear just how little there is out there in the archive of trying to make sense of it, beyond looking at the rather kind of stylized and ideal versions that are presented, theorized versions that are presented in informal kinds of texts. So I'll stop there and just again reiterate one other point which I made earlier, which is I'm partly also interested in how we can then use philosophy as a way of life to open up ways in which we try to make philosophical sense of things like Sufism and different kinds of spiritual practices, as well as open up the possibility of looking at poetry and music as spiritual exercises as well. And because I think both of those would have very clear parallels in other traditions as well. One other parallel which might be worth thinking about, and I haven't articulated it clearly explicitly here, but it's something which I have thought about elsewhere, is the way in which hagiographies and narratives work to facilitate this. So, of course, in the Islamic traditions, as many others, there's a very rich tradition of hagiographies, and many of these are about those we would consider to be sages. And they work as a kind of an inducement and motivation to others to try and make sense of this, and sometimes how the performance or the relating of the hagiography is in itself a spiritual exercise, which is shared amongst adepts to increase their desire for Sajjad. Thank you. Sorry if I've gone a bit over time.
Thank you so much. It was perfect timing. It was very, very informative and also thought-provoking. We now have around half an hour for discussion. Does somebody have a question, a comment to start the discussion? If you do, please raise your hand. Pedro.
Well, thank you very much, for this wonderful talk. It's really an uncharted territory for me, and it's interesting to see these connections and all this work that you've done and that you're still doing. So my question relates to this concept of assimilation to God, homoiousis theoi, the Sufi tradition. Nowadays, it seems there is a controversy, interpretative controversy regarding this motive of homoiousis theoi and the idea of God-likeness in Plato's studies. Because on the one hand, in some dialogues, like the Theaetetus or the Timaeus, you have one strain pulling the likeness to God to an otherworldly dimension and sort of a transcendence from the human condition and from human predicaments. It's more closely attached to theoria, to the contemplation of divine reality and a sort of negation of these worldly attachments. But on the other hand, you have a different idea of God-likeness, which can be glimpsed, for instance, in the idea of the philosopher king of the Republic, which would be to become like God in order to better act in this world and to attain moral virtue and unify your soul so as to live better and act virtuously in this world and contributing to your fellow human beings and building up a better society and so on and so on. So this kind of tension in the interpretation of the idea of God-likeness that, for example, Julia Annas has noted in her book on Platonic ethics, Old and New. And I would like to know if there is some similar tensions in the interpretation of this idea of God-likeness in the Sufi tradition, in the sense of, on the one hand, a transcendence from this world, like God-likeness as transcending from this world and becoming like God and contemplating supramundane realities, or if there's another stream which is more attached to politics and moral life, the improvement of human beings in this world and these kind of things.
So I mean,
So
the kind
thank
of
you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah. So I guess the classic kind of example of the latter, which is the more political kind of Platonopolis approach, is of course the work of Farabi in the early period, and of course there's, Dominic O'Meara in his book on Platonopolis. Actually, his last chapter is on Farabi, which makes a lot of sense. And that is an example of, I guess, what I would call Platonism as a way of life read in that particular kind of direction. For the later tradition, for Sufis, for people like Mullah Sadra, they're not primarily concerned with the political. I mean, of course, they are concerned with the idea that the sage and the philosopher should certainly have a role to play at court as advisors. A lot of the works on statecraft explicitly say so. But rather that godlikeness is a really a notion of self-cultivation. It's about being, as I guess Addo would have it, kind of alone within this world. But it's also one in which that person then also has responsibilities to their particular community and to their students as well. So I think the theoria, the contemplation is otherworldly insofar it's about escaping the vicissitudes of everyday human life, but it's still one which is rooted in this world through the mentoring and the guidance provided. So I think certainly most of the examples I've given you would be on that particular side. But I guess one of the questions comes back to this issue of the body and how much of this requires embodiment. And while in a lot of Sufi texts, and certainly in Mullah Sadr, there's this kind of there are elements of disdain for the body that you find in Neoplatonism. Most of the spiritual exercises that you find seem to take for granted embodiment and take for granted at least some aspect of the way in which embodiment is significant. So so in that sense, it's not entirely about the immaterial and about the otherworldly, because even with the doffing metaphor, yes, you doff the body, but then you do return to the body. It's not about, just kind of going up to the experience of the one and never returning. I think that's a very important aspect of the kind of social responsibility which a lot of Sufis and mullahs have to talk about.
Thank you. We have now a question by Gianfranco Ferraro.
Hi, Rizvi. Thank you very much for your talk. Well, just more or less one main question, and maybe just another as a curiosity. Well, first of all, one of the main points for me of investigation of researching on adults and Foucault's, of course, also approach to philosophy as way of life concerns notion of spirituality. That is the fact that philosophy as a way of life for both the authors cannot be understood without the notion of spirituality. And well, as we know, both Doe and Foucault take the question of spirituality as a problem of transformation of itself and of others too, especially in the case of Foucault. In the sense, well, one point for both the authors is the question of the conversion. So generally, it's not possible to approach philosophy as a way of life without a conversion, without a transformation of the self. In a sense, it will be very interesting to hear you about this point. That is how the, for instance, Sufi's conversion or Islamic's conversion can be looked through this light, this point of view. That is, we can compare and maybe without any other without saying nothing more about the fact that Sufis, for instance, spirituality is the same of philosophical spirituality or not. For instance, that Ado makes an example concerning his own life. That is, he was a very religious person, and at some time he had some sort of mystical experience that made him a philosopher and not more a religious person. So that is very important for me, also for our Oxford handbook, because well, my chapter concerns precisely the notion of spirituality, and well, that is the main question. The little question that it's a sort of curiosity. You of course quoted and also mentioned Avicenne, and the other authors, but one of the authors of well, the classical Arabic philosophy was for me Averroes, and precisely at the time of Averroes, he had to defend philosophy also against some forms of can say religious oppositions, and also some religious theological government in his time. And it was very interesting for me, for instance, one time to to see this film of Youssef Chahine, is an Egyptian director, precisely titled The Destiny, I think. And precisely in this film, he could show the fact that the attitude of a philosopher was something very, very courageous, no, against also what could put in question the possibility to make philosophy completely free. And so this notion of to be completely free in philosophy that could be also can approached as a sort of a spiritual philosophical way of life. And in this sense, I want to hear you precisely about this fact, how this being free can be approached through spiritual Sufi way of life, in this case, compared with a philosophical free way of life. Thank you.
Those are very, very good questions. So on the question of spirituality and a kind of conversion transformation. So yes, I mean, one can very easily find parallels for that. So particularly within Sufi discourse, there's often a discussion about a first step as a turning away from and a turning towards, right? So that there is an initial decision, so to speak, to change the way in which one is, and to take things beyond perhaps basic, fundamental ritual practices and take it towards a different orientation in which, salvation lies in godlikeness, for example, right? And I think, as opposed to merely this question of salvation lies in the acquisition of a successful afterlife in paradise, right? And I think that's certainly something which is articulated in a lot of Sufi texts, that there has to be that change in the way in which you see your life, and also change perhaps in the goal or the destination to which you are striving, and that is very clear. Now, of course, yes. So, I mean, the question there, the fundamental question in many ways is this relationship between, spirituality and religion, or spirituality as a religious commitment, and as I think I've tried to suggest that in most of the cases one can think of in kind of Muslim contexts, it's very difficult to separate the two. However, of course, there are different ways in which one articulates kind of an authentic or a efficacious way of making sense of religion. And that's, I think, precisely where your Averroes example arises, because there's 2 points that Averroes primarily makes. One is that philosophy is not for the unworthy, and so it's not for people who are unfamiliar with philosophical discourse and the aims of philosophy to engage in philosophical discourse, even if it is to refute it. So in his famous kind of counter-refutation to Ghazali, that's precisely what he's trying to do. And he's doing it in a space of freedom, because Ghazali's critique of philosophy is aimed at Avicenna. And Averroes, in his response, is not interested in defending Avicenna, but rather he's interested in defending what he thinks is worthy and in philosophy itself. Of course, there's another work that he wrote, Fasl al-Maqal, which is kind of a legal responsum. So Averroes was also a judge. And in that work, what he very importantly says is that if you really want to understand the nature of revelation, if you really want to understand the nature of what God requires of us through, for example, the law and the moral obligations that belief entails, then you really need to be a philosopher, because it's philosophers who properly understand that. No one else does. And so in that text, he's issuing a legal judgment which is privileging philosophical understanding of religion, so to speak, over other kinds of understanding, whether those are understandings of Sufis, whether those are of lawyers or theologians and so forth. And that, I think that is quite significant. Well, of course, at the same time, I'm not sure to what extent Averroes himself would fit within a philosophy as a way of life kind of approach, precisely because in some ways he says very little about spiritual exercises. He says very little about how one acquires this particular path. But I think on the question of freedom, the freedom arises through what already by the time of Averroes, but certainly later in the philosophical traditions, is known as tahqiq. And tahqiq is this notion of sometimes it's called verification, sometimes it's realization. And this is freedom with respect to what one arrives at through arguments and through debate and discourse. So it is insufficient, and I gave you the example of Mullah Sadr's definition of wisdom. It's insufficient to merely rehearse arguments and to imitate arguments and to imitate positions. That's not how you do philosophy. Philosophy requires the person guided by the sage to understand for themselves what the position is, and to, in a sense, come up with arguments and understandings which are particular to them. They have to realize that in themselves, because it's only that way that they can kind of transform their knowledge, transform themselves, and become something else. So in that sense, there is a sense of freedom in that process. But of course, as you can imagine, saying that philosophers are those who have the best ability and authority and the best kind of vision of reality to tell people what religion is understandably controversial, right? And almost definitely was the reason. For example, Sohrawardi, who I mentioned, he was executed in 1191. It's unclear what the charges are, but one of them may well be precisely the way in which he's articulating Platonism as a way of life which is superior to any other in the milieu, as well as some of the kinds of spiritual exercises which he some of the theurgic exercises in particular that he was articulating involved certain kinds of occult and practices, invocations of higher celestial beings and so forth, which certainly would have, I mean, at court they were frowned upon, and they were certainly one of the reasons why he was executed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a question by Fabrizio Boscaglia, one of the main experts of Sufism in Portugal. Fabrizio.
Thank you, Marta. You're too generous. Thank you, Sajjad. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for your very informative talk. And I really appreciated that you talked about something that it's not really talked about in the academic field in Portugal, which is the distinction and articulation between falsafa and hikmah, and especially the fact that Mullah Sadr, who is commonly studied here, I mean, not very much studied, but when he is studied, is more on the transcendental aspect, not really in that practical and spiritual, worldly, let's say worldly spirituality, or my more immanent dimension, which is key in Sufism. And we have to say that we not often we deal with it, with that more practical and transformational immanent dimension. I have 3 questions. I mean, maybe there is no time for answering the 3 of them, but since I appreciated a lot the themes that you touched, I want to value this occasion. So if there's time, Marta, if not, just one of them would be great if you can answer, Sajjad. So the first is about the Quranic verse which contains the expression Kunu Rabbaniyin in Surah Al-Imran, which sometimes in Sufism, I'm thinking, for example, of a contemporary Sufi called Maulana Sheikh Nazim. It is interpreted in a slightly different way than we find in, for example, in English or Portuguese translations. Rabbani or Rabbaniyun is sometimes translated as pious or devoted scholars, but it seems that this word kind of hides and manifests something which is more connected with the God-likeness that you talked about. Tell me if you agree, and I would be interested to know if there is more literature on this word interpreted in a God-likeness sense. This is the first question. The second is, I don't remember, maybe you mentioned it or not. I would like to ask you if you think that the practice of dhikrullah can be interpreted within this like Islamic notion or of spiritual exercise, or comparing to Hadot and other Western philosophers, if it makes sense to consider dhikr as a spiritual exercise within this critical and more wide vision of philosophy as aware of life. And thirdly, since you are an expert on the Eastern tradition and also on the Shia tradition, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, but not see.
I think that the video went away. I don't know why. Doesn't matter. I would like to know if you consider also some Western authors, namely, for example, Ibn Arabi, since scholars like Sayyid Hussein Nasser often kind of see authors like Mullah Sadra or Sohrawardi as, let's say, kind of similar to Ibn Arabi and vice versa. Well, thank you. I know it's too many questions, but
No, thank you. So in some ways, the simple answer to all 3 is yes, but just to kind of unpack that. So Mullah Sadr and a number of other people in the Safavid tradition use this phrase alim Rabbani. Of course, alim Rabbani, of course, ultimately does come from the Kunu Rabbaniyun in the Quran, but it also comes from explicit sayings of the Imams, which one finds in the Shia tradition. So that's already kind of a category. Now, the way in which they then describe it is precisely in terms of God-likeness, right? So the Alim Rabbani is precisely the one who has been undergoing this process of acquiring the divine eternal virtues, takhalluqu bi akhlaqillah, in the Sufi tradition, and precisely the one who, I would actually translate Rabbani as divine or godlike, precisely because then that person has the kind of the divine vision, right? So one of the points precisely of godlikeness is that you are capable of seeing reality as it truly is, and ascribing a rational order to the cosmos and so forth in the way that God does so. So yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely essential to the notion of godlikeness, and is explicitly so the term, which in many ways starts with Sahrawardi, but then is taken up later, is for godlikeness is ta'alluh, right, in Arabic. And so, he has this particular term of the muta'allih, so the one who, is seeking and is acquiring godlikeness. Yeah, this comes up again and again throughout the later tradition to describe those who particularly have this certain vision of what the end of their practice and their spiritual path is. On the question of zikr, so yeah, this is precisely why I said that in a lot of these figures, what they consider to be spiritual exercises are also religious exercises, such as the invocation of divine names, which of course are widespread in religious practice. I think the distinction might be the way in which, I use the term divine name theurgy to describe what the dhikr is, because the whole point is, there are lots of Sufi texts like the Miftah al-Falah of Ibn Ata'illah, which, what is the function of invoking a particular divine name? Well, it has this particular kind of effect, and this has this particular, acts as this particular transformative switch in the soul, which changes it in a particular direction, right? And in that sense, it is directly linked with godlikeness, and it is precisely that it is the practice of acquiring the divine virtues, the khuluq wa akhlaqullah. So in that sense, I think dhikr is a religious practice, but it's also certainly something which is which makes sense in this broader context of why this particular path of salvation, and why this particular pursuit of wisdom. So in that sense, I certainly think it is essential. It's not, and I think part of it comes down to this. Part of the problem is how we understand religion, and what we think the limitations of the term religious is, as opposed to spiritual. And I mean, we don't have to revisit it, but there's like a huge literature on the way in which the concept of religion has been kind of constructed post-Enlightenment in the West in a particular direction, which then makes it quite difficult to see how the religious can actually be spiritual, or how the religious can be much more than just the mere rehearsal of ritual kinds of practices. And yes, on the third one, on Ibn Arabi, absolutely. So I mean, some of the passages which I have on Mullah Sadr actually do come from Ibn Arabi, and they're in many ways, I think Ibn Arabi is a good example of a Sufi who can be read through the prism of Ado. And in some ways, Organaiki's work on Tijani Sufism kind of shows you that, because there is a lot in Tijani Sufism which basically comes from the Ibn Arabi tradition. Where there's the conception of reality, where there's certain kinds of practices, is where there's certain kinds of invocations and exegetical practices and so forth. So it would be a fairly obvious thing to do, would be to bring someone like Ibn Arabi into conversation with Ado, and not just Ibn Arabi, but maybe even Ibn Sab'in. So Ibn Sab'in, of course, who is much more kind of, I mean, he's kind of, for many of us who don't know his work very well, he strikes as being really kind of weird and wacky and kind of out there. just because it's not either philosophy as we normally understand it, nor is it Sufism as we normally understand it. There's, all sorts of engagements with Hermeticism and the occult and, other kinds of inheritances coming from the Brethren of Purity and so forth. So, yeah, I think there certainly are other kinds of authors. I mean, I think the question is to develop maybe like a palette of different kinds of case studies of what might and might not work, and see it through. Because, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I don't think we should make philosophy as a way of life kind of a totalizing way of understanding Islamic philosophical traditions, because there clearly are some which just won't fit, and they're not interested in that. They don't necessarily think philosophy is a path of salvation, or a path to a particular vision of reality. They just think it's a very, fairly straightforward tool, which may or may not be used. So it's worth bearing that in mind.
Thank you very much. We could go on and on, but we leave space to the other people. Just for the other people to the thing about Ibn Arabi is key if you want to study the Islamic philosophy in the Western Peninsula during the Middle Ages, what today is Portugal, and what Sajjad is saying about the Ikhwan, the tradition of some mystical literature which influenced Muslim thinkers from Silvish, from Mertula, from Lole. So it's not out of context at all.
Thank you, Fabrizio. We are already beyond our limit, but there's still one question by Sofia Munoz. I need to ask you to be very, very, very brief. 30 seconds answer, 30 seconds reply, please.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me properly. Yes,
Yep.
okay. So I'm doing my dissertation currently on Ibn Tufail's Hay Ibn Yaqzan, and it's just a curiosity, and it's how you think that the godlikeness concept could apply to Tufail's work. Is the short version of my question.
And I guess the short answer is yes, but it's somewhat complicated because, well, I mean, one of the questions is how one kind of arrives at that, and yeah, what where is the spiritual master and mentor in the process? And I think that's one of the challenges for looking at Hay, because I think Hay is normally seen in terms of this kind of, this person who achieves through the pure exercise of the will, so to speak, and I think most, if not all, the traditions of godlikeness I can think of do require the mentorship of a sage, a sage, and that's why it's interesting. But the conception of what the end is of philosophy, I think, is the same, because godlikeness was such a pervasive idea throughout philosophical traditions in Islam.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will now need to close the session. Thank you all for your presence, and thank you especially Sajjad for this really exciting talk and discussion. We'll come back one last time on February 12th for a special session where we are going to make a kind of balance of this ending project and discuss future prospects for research on PWL. So I hope to see you then. Meanwhile, take care and bye-bye. See you next time. Bye. Thank you.